Chapter 2, Unit 2, Economic Indicators and the Business Cycle. Part 2.1, The Circular Flow and GDP. The economy as a living system. Imagine the economy as a giant body, not a machine, not a factory, but a living, breathing organism where blood has to keep moving or everything falls apart. That blood is money, and the system that keeps it circulating is what economists call the circular flow model. Once you genuinely understand this model, GDP stops being an abstract number on a news ticker and starts making intuitive sense. So let's walk through it together. At its most basic, the circular flow involves two main players: households and firms. Households own all the resources, their labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurial ability. Economists bundle these together and call them the factors of production. Firms, on the other hand, produce the goods and services we all want to buy. So here's the elegant loop. Households supply their resources to firms through the factor market, and firms pay them back in the form of wages, rent, interest, and profit, collectively called factor payments or income. Then households take that income right back into the product market where they spend it on the goods and services firms produce. Money flows in a circle endlessly, hence the name. Adding the real-world complications. Now, a two-sector model is a beautiful starting point, but the real economy has more moving parts. When you sit down for the AP exam, you'll likely see the full circular flow with four sectors: households, firms, the government, and the foreign sector, the rest of the world. The government collects taxes from both households and firms and injects money back in through government spending on things like roads, schools, and defense. The foreign sector introduces exports, goods we sell to other countries, which brings money in, and imports, goods we buy from abroad, which sends money out. Here's the key insight the AP loves to test. Money doesn't just flow, it also leaks out and injects back in. Savings, taxes, and imports are all leakages. They pull money out of the spending stream. Investment, government spending, and exports are injections. They push money back in. When injections equal leakages, the economy is in a kind of equilibrium. Tuck that away. It'll resurface when you study fiscal policy. Defining GDP the right way. All of that circular flow activity produces a measurable outcome: gross domestic product, or GDP. The definition you need to own is this: GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given time period, typically 1 year. Every word in that definition is doing important work. Market value means we measure things in dollar terms so we can add apples and aircraft carriers together. Final goods and services means we're only counting the end product, not the steel that went into the car, not the flour that went into the bread, because counting intermediate goods would mean counting the same value multiple times. That mistake is called double counting, and it's a classic AP trap. Within a country's borders distinguishes GDP from GNP, gross national product, which counts output by a country's citizens regardless of where they live. An American working in Tokyo contributes to Japan's GDP, but to the US GNP. The distinction matters, but GDP is your primary focus here. The expenditure approach, your formula. The most important formula in this entire unit is the expenditure approach to GDP. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Think of it as a recipe. C is consumption, all household spending on goods and services, the single largest component in most economies. I is investment, but careful here, because in economics, investment means business spending on capital goods like equipment, machinery, and new construction, including new homes, not buying stocks and bonds. That's another pitfall students walk right into. G is government spending on goods and services. Note that transfer payments like Social Security or unemployment checks are not included, because no new good or service is produced in exchange. Finally, XM is net exports, exports minus imports. If a country sells more than it buys from the world, net exports are positive. If it buys more, net exports are negative. A handy mnemonic: can I go exploring mindfully? C, I, G, X, M, goofy? Maybe, but you'll remember it at 8 a.m. on test day. Real versus nominal GDP. One last concept you absolutely cannot skip: the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is measured in current prices. It goes up whenever output rises or whenever prices rise. Real GDP strips out inflation by using a base year's prices. so it only rises when actual output increases. Real GDP is the better measure of economic health because it tells you whether the economy is actually producing more stuff, not just charging more for the same stuff. When you see a question asking whether living standards have truly improved, always reach for real GDP. Wrapping the loop. The circular flow and GDP are really two sides of the same coin. One shows you how economic activity moves through the economy, and the other gives you a scorecard for measuring how much activity actually happened. With these foundations locked in, you're perfectly set up to explore what happens when GDP starts fluctuating, which is exactly where we're headed next into the business cycle. Part 2.2 Limitations of GDP. GDP isn't the whole story. So you've learned how to calculate GDP, and that's great. But here's where things get really interesting. Imagine you have a friend who brags about making $200,000 a year. Sounds impressive, right? But what if they work 100-hour weeks, live in a city with brutal pollution, have zero time for family, and spend every dollar on medical bills? Suddenly, that income figure doesn't tell you much about how well their life is actually going. That's exactly the problem economists have with GDP. It measures the size of an economy's output, but it misses enormous swaths of what makes an economy and a society actually function well. The AP exam loves to test whether you understand not just what GDP is, but what it can't do. What GDP fails to capture. Let's start with the big one. GDP ignores the distribution of income. Suppose a country's GDP grows by 10% in a single year. Sounds like a booming economy. But if all of that new income flows to the top 1% while everyone else treads water, the average person's standard of living hasn't improved at all. GDP per capita, which you get by dividing total GDP by the population, is a little better because it gives you a per-person average, but averages can be deeply misleading. Think of it this way. If Bill Gates walks into a coffee shop, the average net worth of everyone inside shoots through the roof, even though nobody else got richer. GDP per capita has the same blind spot. Next, GDP completely ignores the underground economy, all the transactions that never get officially recorded. This includes illegal activity like drug trafficking, but also perfectly legal things like paying your neighbor cash to mow your lawn or a teenager babysitting without reporting it as income. In some countries, especially developing economies, the informal sector is massive. This means GDP can significantly undercount actual economic activity. On your AP exam, if you see a question asking why a country's GDP might underestimate its true output, the underground economy is your answer. Non-market activities and negative externalities. Here's another gap that trips up a lot of students: non-market production. When a parent stays home to raise children, that's enormously valuable work. But because no money changes hands, it doesn't show up in GDP at all. Same goes for volunteer work, caring for an elderly relative, or even cooking your own meals instead of ordering delivery. Ironically, if you hire someone to do those exact same tasks, GDP goes up. The economy looks better on paper, even though the same amount of real work is being done. This is a genuine distortion, and the AP exam may ask you to identify examples of valuable activities that GDP misses. Now flip it around. GDP also counts things that hurt us. This is the concept of negative externalities, costs imposed on third parties that aren't reflected in market prices. When a factory pollutes a river, cleaning up that pollution actually increases GDP because cleanup costs money. You can have an oil spill and watch GDP tick upward as the response kicks in. That's a little absurd, right? GDP treats the disaster and the recovery as economic wins. A better measure of well-being would subtract the environmental damage, but standard GDP doesn't do that. Leisure, quality of life, and better alternatives. GDP also says nothing about leisure time. Americans, on average, work significantly more hours per year than workers in many European countries. European GDP per capita may be lower, but citizens often report higher life satisfaction because they have more vacation time, stronger social safety nets, and better work-life balance. GDP would call the American economy better while missing all of that context entirely. And what about quality improvements? A smartphone today is incomparably more powerful than one from 10 years ago. But if prices stay roughly the same, GDP doesn't fully capture that leap in real value. Economists try to adjust for this, but it's an imperfect science. This is why economists have developed alternative measures to supplement GDP. The Human Development Index, HDI, used by the United Nations, combines income with life expectancy and education levels to give a broader picture of human well-being. The Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, attempts to account for income inequality, environmental costs, and the value of non-market work. For the AP exam, you don't need deep knowledge of these alternatives, but you should know they exist because GDP has limitations and be able to explain what gap each one tries to fill. The AP pitfall to avoid. Here's the classic mistake students make. They assume that because GDP is limited, it's useless. Don't fall into that trap. GDP is still the most widely used measure of economic output and is genuinely valuable for tracking economic growth, comparing countries broadly, and identifying recessions. The AP exam wants you to appreciate both its power and its blind spots, not to throw it out entirely. A good mnemonic to remember GDP's major limitations is DONQ, distribution of income ignored, U underground economy missed, non-market production excluded, Q quality of life and externalities overlooked. With a firm handle on what GDP can and cannot tell us, you're ready to explore how economists actually track the economy's ups and downs over time, which brings us right to the business cycle. Part 2.3, Unemployment. What is unemployment, really? Let's start with something that might surprise you. When economists talk about unemployment, they're not just talking about people who don't have jobs, they're talking about a very specific group. And understanding exactly who counts is one of the most tested ideas on the AP exam. The labor force is the foundation of everything here. It's made up of everyone who is either employed or actively looking for work. Notice that word actively. If your neighbor graduated in May, got frustrated after a few rejections, and stopped sending out resumes altogether, she's no longer counted in the labor force. She's become what economists call a discouraged worker. And here's the AP pitfall. She is not counted as unemployed. She's simply out of the labor force. This is one of the trickiest distinctions the exam loves to test. So the formula you absolutely need to know is this. The unemployment rate equals the number of unemployed divided by the labor force multiplied by 100. Simple enough on its face, but the devil is in the details of who goes in each category. The three types of unemployment. Think of unemployment like a doctor categorizing different kinds of headaches. They all hurt, but the causes and the treatments are completely different. Frictional unemployment is the normal, even healthy kind. It's what happens when someone voluntarily leaves one job to find a better one, or when a recent college grad is searching for their first position. There's always going to be some time between jobs as workers and employers find their best match. Picture it like musical chairs. Between rounds, everyone's up and moving. That transition time is frictional unemployment. It's unavoidable and not particularly concerning. Structural unemployment is more serious. This happens when there's a mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills employers need. Think about what happened to workers in the coal industry as renewable energy expanded, or to travel agents when the internet came along. The jobs didn't just move, they fundamentally changed or disappeared. Structural unemployment often requires retraining, and it can persist for a long time. When the AP exam asks you to distinguish between frictional and structural, ask yourself, is this a temporary search, or is there a deeper skills gap? That's your signal. Cyclical unemployment is the one tied directly to the business cycle, hence the name. When the economy contracts and businesses start laying people off, that's cyclical unemployment rising. When the economy is booming and companies are hiring again, cyclical unemployment falls. This is the type policymakers focus on most urgently because it's driven by a lack of demand in the economy rather than anything the worker did wrong. The AP exam often connects cyclical unemployment to recessionary gaps. More on that when we get to output gaps. The natural rate of unemployment. Here's a concept that confuses a lot of students. The idea of full employment doesn't mean zero unemployment. Let that sink in for a second. Even in a perfectly healthy economy, there will always be some frictional and structural unemployment. People will always be between jobs or transitioning careers. So economists define full employment as the point where cyclical unemployment equals zero. And the unemployment that remains is called the natural rate of unemployment, or the NRU. A useful mnemonic, NRU equals no cyclical unemployment. The natural rate includes only frictional and structural unemployment. In the United States, the NRU is generally estimated to be somewhere around 4 to 5%, though this shifts over time as the economy changes. When the actual unemployment rate equals the NRU, the economy is said to be producing at its potential output, which you'll also see labeled as the long-run equilibrium on the ADA's model. Why the unemployment rate isn't the whole story. The AP exam sometimes asks you to think critically about the limitations of the unemployment rate as a measure of economic health. Two big issues come up repeatedly. First, discouraged workers, as we mentioned, aren't counted, which means the official rate can understate the true level of hardship in the economy. Second, underemployed workers, people working part-time who want full-time work, or someone with a PhD working as a barista, are counted as fully employed. So the unemployment rate can paint a rosier picture than reality. There's also a subtle but important relationship worth knowing. Unemployment and inflation often move in opposite directions, a connection described by the Phillips curve. When unemployment is low, employers compete for workers, wages rise, and inflation tends to increase. When unemployment is high, that pressure releases. You'll dig into this relationship more deeply in Unit 5, but keep it in the back of your mind as we build toward the bigger macroeconomic picture. A quick pitfall checklist. Before any AP question about unemployment, ask yourself three things. Is this person in the labor force at all? What type of unemployment does this scenario represent? And is the economy at, above, or below its natural rate? Those three questions will unlock most of what the exam throws at you. Now that you have a clear picture of how unemployment is measured and categorized, we're ready to turn to the third major economic indicator, the price level, and explore how inflation shapes the purchasing power of every dollar in your wallet. Part 2.4, Price Indices and Inflation. What is inflation? Really? Let's start with a story. Imagine your grandmother telling you she used to buy a movie ticket for a quarter. You probably laughed. But here's the thing. That's not funny. That's economics. The reason a quarter doesn't buy much today is inflation, and understanding it is one of the most practical things you'll take away from this entire course. Inflation is a sustained increase in the overall price level of goods and services in an economy over time. Notice that word sustained. One bad week at the grocery store doesn't count. We're talking about a broad, ongoing trend. And the flip side? Deflation is a sustained decrease in the price level, which sounds great until you realize it usually signals a struggling economy where people stop spending because they expect prices to fall even further. There's also disinflation, which trips up a lot of students. That just means the rate of inflation is slowing down, not that prices are falling. If inflation goes from 8% to 3%, that's disinflation. How we measure it, the Consumer Price Index. So how does the government actually measure inflation? That's where the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, comes in. Think of the CPI as a giant shopping cart. Each month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics sends economists out to track the prices of a fixed market basket of goods and services that a typical urban consumer buys, things like food, housing, clothing, transportation, and medical care. They compare what that basket costs today to what it cost in a designated base year, and that comparison gives us the CPI. The formula is straightforward, and you absolutely need to know it for the AP exam. CPI equals cost of market basket in current year divided by cost of market basket in base year, say times 100. In the base year, CPI is always 100. That's your anchor point. If the CPI rises to 115, that means the price level has increased by 15% since the base year. Clean and simple. From there, you can calculate the NSLX inflation rate between any 2 years. Inflation rate equals CPI in new year minus CPI in old year divided by CPI in old year times 100. This is just a percentage change formula dressed up in economics clothing. If CPI goes from 120 to 132, that's a 10% inflation rate. Practice this until it's automatic. The GDP deflator, CPI's less famous cousin. There's another price index worth knowing, the GDP deflator. While the CPI tracks a fixed basket of consumer goods, the GDP deflator is broader. It measures the price level of all goods and services produced in the economy. It's used to convert nominal GDP into real GDP, which strips out the effect of inflation, so we can see whether the economy actually grew or just had rising prices doing the heavy lifting. Real GDP equals nominal GDP divided by GDP deflator, 19 times 100. The key difference to remember, the CPI reflects what consumers buy, while the GDP deflator reflects what the economy produces. The AP exam loves testing whether you know which tool to use in a given scenario. Why inflation matters, winners and losers. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Inflation doesn't treat everyone equally. If you borrowed money at a fixed interest rate and inflation unexpectedly spikes, you're actually winning. You're paying back that loan with dollars that are worth less than when you borrowed them. Your creditor, on the other hand, is losing purchasing power. This is why economists distinguish between nominal interest rates, the stated rate, and real interest rates adjusted for inflation. Connected by the Fisher effect, real interest rate, nominal interest rate minus inflation rate, people on fixed incomes like retirees receiving a set pension get hurt by inflation because their purchasing power erodes. Workers whose wages keep pace with or exceed inflation, they're relatively protected. This is why cost of living adjustments or COLAs exist. AP exam pitfalls to avoid. A few things consistently trip up test takers. First, don't confuse a rising CPI with high prices. The CPI tells you about the rate of change, not the absolute level. Second, the CPI has known limitations. It uses a fixed basket, so it doesn't account for consumers substituting cheaper goods when prices rise, substitution bias. And it may not fully capture improvements in product quality over time, quality bias. These biases tend to make the CPI slightly overstate true inflation. Third, remember that deflation sounds friendly, but is generally feared by economists. Falling prices can lead to a deflationary spiral where reduced spending causes more job losses, which causes even less spending. A quick mnemonic to keep CPI straight. Think C for consumer, C for cart. The CPI is the consumer's cart of goods being priced over time. Bringing it together. Inflation is one of those concepts that connects everything else in macroeconomics. It affects interest rates, purchasing power, business investment decisions, and government policy in ways you'll keep seeing throughout the course. Once you're comfortable measuring it and understanding who it helps and hurts, you'll have the foundation you need to make sense of how central banks, like the Federal Reserve, respond to it, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 2.5 Costs of Inflation. What inflation actually costs you. All right, so we've talked about what inflation is, that general sustained rise in the price level. But now I want you to think about something more personal. What does inflation actually do to people? Because here's the thing, the headlines miss. Inflation isn't just an abstract economic statistic. It reshapes who wins and who loses in an economy, often in ways that feel deeply unfair. Let's walk through exactly why that matters for the AP exam and for your life. Purchasing power, the silent pickpocket. Start with the most fundamental cost, the erosion of purchasing power. Purchasing power is simply how much real stuff your money can buy. When inflation rises, each dollar in your wallet buys a little less than it did yesterday. Think of it like this. Imagine you stuffed $100 under your mattress in January. By December, if inflation ran at 10%, that $100 can only buy what $90 worth of goods could have bought at the start of the year. The money didn't disappear, but its value did. Inflation is like a silent pickpocket who never touches your wallet but still walks away with part of your purchasing power. This is why economists distinguish so carefully between nominal values and real values. Nominal is the dollar amount you can see. Real is what that amount actually buys after accounting for inflation. The formula you need to know is real value equals nominal value divided by price level or price index. When the AP exam asks you to adjust for inflation or calculate real wages, this relationship is your best friend. Winners and losers, the redistribution effect. Now here's where inflation gets genuinely interesting and genuinely unfair. Inflation doesn't hit everyone equally. It redistributes wealth from some groups to others, and the AP exam loves testing whether you understand who gets hurt and who benefits. Consider borrowers versus lenders. Suppose you borrow $10,000 at a fixed interest rate, promising to pay it back in 5 years. If inflation unexpectedly surges during those 5 years, the dollars you repay are worth less in real terms than the dollars you borrowed. You, the borrower, win. Your lender, who is expecting to get back real purchasing power, loses. This is why unexpected inflation tends to benefit debtors and hurt creditors, and why banks charge higher nominal interest rates when they expect inflation to be elevated. This connects directly to the Fisher effect, which tells us that the nominal interest rate equals real interest rate plus expected inflation rate. Lenders build expected inflation into the rates they charge, so they aren't caught off guard. The danger comes from unexpected inflation, the kind nobody planned for. People on fixed incomes get hit especially hard. Think about a retiree living on a pension that pays a flat $2,000 a month. If inflation rises by 8%, their check still says $2,000. But they can afford noticeably less food, medicine, and heating. Their nominal income is frozen while the real world gets more expensive around them. Meanwhile, someone whose wages are indexed to inflation, rising automatically as prices rise, is largely protected. This is why cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, exist in many contracts and government programs. Menu costs and shoe leather costs. Two costs of inflation that show up on almost every AP exam are menu costs and shoe leather costs. And I want you to have crystal clear definitions for both. Menu costs refer to the real resources businesses spend simply changing their prices. The name comes from restaurants having to literally reprint menus, but it applies to any firm updating price tags, reprinting catalog, or reprogramming point of sale systems. When inflation is stable and low, you don't have to do this very often. When inflation is high and volatile, you're constantly scrambling to update prices. And that takes time, labor, and money that could have gone towards something productive. Shoe leather costs are a bit more metaphorical, but just as real. When inflation is high, holding cash is costly because its value is eroding. So people make more frequent trips to the bank, moving money into interest-bearing accounts to preserve their purchasing power. The shoe leather refers to wearing out your shoes from all those extra trips, which today we'd translate into time, transaction fees, and the mental energy spent managing your money more actively. Anything that causes people to waste resources simply avoiding the effects of inflation counts as a shoe leather cost. The AP pitfall zone. Here's the trap. Students fall into most often confusing anticipated inflation with unanticipated inflation. Anticipated inflation, when everyone expects it and plans accordingly, causes relatively modest distortions. Menu costs, shoe leather costs, but not the massive wealth redistribution. Unanticipated inflation is the truly damaging kind because it catches people in contracts, loans, and savings plans that were built on the wrong assumptions. Always ask yourself, was this inflation expected or not? Your answer changes everything about who gets hurt. Also remember that hyperinflation, extreme, runaway inflation can destabilize entire economies by destroying confidence in currency and making long-term planning essentially impossible. Think of Germany in the 1920s or Zimbabwe in the 2000s, where prices doubled by the hour and people carried cash in wheelbarrows. That's the far end of the spectrum, but it illustrates why price stability is one of the Fed's core goals. With a firm grasp on the costs inflation imposes on households, businesses, and lenders, you're perfectly set up to explore how the government actually measures that inflation, which is exactly where we're heading next with price indices and the Consumer Price Index. Part 2.6, Real v. Nominal GDP. The price tag problem. Imagine you're comparing your grandmother's grocery bill from 1975 to yours today. She spent $50 and walked out with a cart overflowing with food. You spend $50 and barely cover a week of lunches. Does that mean the economy produced less food for you than it did for her? Of course not. Prices just changed. This is exactly the problem economists run into when they try to measure how much an economy is actually growing. And it's the whole reason we have two different versions of GDP, nominal and real. Nominal GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given year, measured in current prices, meaning whatever prices happen to be that year. It's the raw, unadjusted number. Real GDP, on the other hand, strips out the effect of price changes by measuring output using the prices from a fixed reference point called the base year. Real GDP tells you what's actually happening with production, not just with prices. The formula and the GDP deflator. Here's where the math comes in, and it's simpler than it looks. The relationship between nominal and real GDP is expressed through the GDP deflator, which is the price index economists use specifically for this adjustment. The formula is GDP deflator equals nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Multiply not real, yeah, real GDP. GDP. There. Real GDP equals nominal GDP divided by GDP deflator times 100. Think of the GDP deflator as a lens cleaner for your economic binoculars. Nominal GDP gives you a blurry picture because inflation is fogging up the lens. Divide by the deflator, and suddenly you can see clearly how much real production actually occurred. Here's a concrete example. Suppose in year one, the base year, nominal GDP is $500 billion. Because it's the base year, the GDP deflator equals 100, and real GDP also equals $500 billion. They're the same. Now suppose in year 2, nominal GDP rises to $600 billion, but the GDP deflator is 120. Real GDP equals 600b divided by 120 no my tams 100 equals seconds dassers seconds lax slaps das seconds real 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 G like real right. When prices rise and output actually grows. Now, flip the scenario. If nominal GDP rises to $660 billion in year 3 and the GDP deflator is still 120, real GDP equals 660b divided by 120, multiply 100 is equals $550 billion. Here, the economy genuinely produced more. The country isn't just charging more for the same stuff, it's actually making more stuff. That's real economic growth, and it's what policymakers actually care about. A quick rule of thumb worth memorizing. If nominal GDP grows faster than the price level, real GDP increases. If the price level grows faster than nominal GDP, real GDP actually falls, even if the raw dollar number looks bigger. The AP exam will absolutely try to trick you with this. Graphing it, the price level connection. On the AP exam, you'll often see this concept connected to the aggregate demand aggregate supply model. When the price level in an economy rises, say because of demand pull inflation, nominal GDP rises, but real GDP might not move at all if output stays the same. This is represented on the ADA's graph as a movement along the horizontal axis, real GDP versus a shift in the price level on the vertical axis. Real GDP is always what's plotted on the horizontal axis of that graph, which is your reminder that the model is already correcting for price changes. Common AP pitfalls. Students make two classic mistakes here. First, they confuse a rising nominal GDP with a growing economy. Remember, prices alone can inflate that number without a single additional unit being produced. Second, students mix up the GDP deflator with the Consumer Price Index, CPI. Both measure inflation, but the GDP deflator covers all goods and services produced domestically, while the CPI tracks a fixed basket of goods bought by a typical urban consumer. The AP exam treats these as distinct tools. Don't swap them. A mnemonic that helps: think real is revealed. Real GDP reveals what's truly happening beneath the surface of prices. Nominal is the name tag on the price. It's just what things are called in today's dollars. Why this all matters. At the end of the day, governments and economists track real GDP because it's the truest measure of living standards and economic performance over time. If you want to know whether people are genuinely better off than they were a decade ago, you need to compare apples to apples, same prices, different quantities. That's real GDP doing its job. With a firm grip on the difference between nominal and real GDP, you're perfectly set up to tackle the next big concept in Unit 2, the unemployment rate and how economists measure who's actually working in this economy. Part 2.7 Business Cycles. The economy's heartbeat. Imagine the economy as a living, breathing organism, and like any living thing, it doesn't grow in a perfectly straight line. It expands, it contracts, it catches a fever, it recovers. That rhythmic up and down movement of real GDP over time is what economists call the business cycle, and understanding its phases, its vocabulary, and its quirks is absolutely essential for the AP exam. Let's build this picture together from the ground up. The 4 phases. Picture a roller coaster. At the bottom of the hill, you're at a trough, the lowest point of economic activity in a given cycle. Real GDP is at its minimum, unemployment is painfully high, and consumer confidence is in the basement. Nobody's spending, nobody's hiring, and the whole economy feels like it's running on fumes. Then the coaster starts climbing. That upward movement is called an expansion, sometimes called a recovery. Real GDP is rising, unemployment is falling, businesses are investing, and people are feeling optimistic again. When an expansion is prolonged and particularly strong, you might hear it called a boom. Think of the roaring 1990s tech expansion. Consumer spending was surging, unemployment dropped to historic lows, and GDP was growing at a healthy clip year after year. Eventually, the coaster crests the hill. That peak is called, you guessed it, the Peak. This is the highest point of economic activity before things start heading back down. Output is at its maximum. Unemployment is near its lowest, and on paper, everything looks fantastic. But peaks are sneaky. You usually don't know you're at the top until you're already on the way down. And then comes the descent, the contraction. Real GDP is falling, unemployment is rising, and businesses start pulling back on investment. Here's a crucial AP vocabulary note. A contraction that lasts for 2 or more consecutive quarters, 6 months of declining real GDP, is officially called a recession. The AP exam loves to test this definition, so burn it into your memory. A particularly severe and prolonged recession is called a depression, the most famous being the Great Depression of the 1930s, when unemployment hit 25% and GDP collapsed by nearly a third. What drives the cycle? Business cycles aren't random noise. They're driven by shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, concepts you'll dig into deeply in Units 3 and 4. For now, understand that anything that causes consumers, businesses, governments, or foreign buyers to spend more or less can push the economy into expansion or contraction. A sudden collapse in consumer confidence. Think the 2008 financial crisis, a spike in oil prices, or a global pandemic can all send the economy spiraling downward. Conversely, a burst of technological innovation or a surge in government spending can lift it back up. The unemployment connection. Here's something the AP exam will absolutely test. The relationship between the business cycle and unemployment moves inversely with GDP. When real GDP is rising during an expansion, unemployment falls. When GDP contracts, unemployment rises. This relationship is formalized in Okun's law, which suggests that for every 1% GDP falls below its potential, unemployment rises by roughly 0.5%. You don't need to calculate Okun's law precisely on the AP exam, but knowing that GDP and unemployment move in opposite directions is non-negotiable. Potential GDP and the output gap. One of the most important concepts layered onto the business cycle is potential GDP, the level of output an economy can produce when all resources are being used at their full sustainable capacity, essentially at the natural rate of unemployment. Think of it as the economy's speed limit. When actual GDP is above potential GDP, you have an inflationary gap, sometimes called a positive output gap. The economy is running hot, like a car engine being pushed past its red line. Prices start rising, and inflation becomes the concern. When actual GDP falls below potential GDP, you have a recessionary gap, negative output gap. The economy is underperforming, leaving workers unemployed and resources idle. The AP exam frequently asks you to identify which gap exists based on where the economy sits in the business cycle. Expansion pushing past potential, inflationary gap. Contraction falling short of potential, recessionary gap. Keep that straight. Common AP pitfalls. A few traps students fall into every year. First, don't confuse a contraction with a recession. A recession requires 2 consecutive quarters of decline. A brief dip is just a contraction. Second, remember that GDP and unemployment move in opposite directions. This trips up students who mix up the direction of change. Third, business cycles are measured using real GDP, adjusted for inflation, not nominal GDP. A handy mnemonic for the 4 phases in order: turtles, eat PB, lead, trough, expansion, P, C, contraction, weird, yes, memorable, absolutely. Tying it together. The business cycle is the economy's story told in chapters, sometimes triumphant, sometimes difficult, always moving. Every policy tool you'll study for the rest of this course exists in some way to smooth out those wild swings, to shorten recessions, cool off inflationary booms, and keep the economy humming as close to its potential as possible. With that foundation in place, you're perfectly set up to understand how economists actually measure economic health, starting with the most famous yardstick of all, GDP, and how we calculate it.